Episode 4 Conclusion. On Freud's account, what we are witnessing is an ego initially succumbing to the exigencies of the external world, and subsequently being strengthened by the knowledge of the possible operations of the superego in accordance with the Greek idea of arete, doing the right thing in the right way at the right time. In this scenario, what we are partly seeing is the power of human freedom in a powerful deterministic world, containing causal forces that will eventually bring about the extinction of all life forms. The fact that rationality is merely a potentiality, and not fully actualized in the species, also highlights the importance of the oracular proclamation that everything created by man is destined for ruin and destruction. Kant, the Enlightenment rationalist, also takes this aspect of human existence into account and makes a proclamation of his own, namely, that rationality will only be actualized in the species of man over a period of 100,000 years. This is, indeed, a long period of suffering for the discontented ego to mourn its lost objects of desire. Both the causal powers of the external world and the powers of his fellow man threaten the existence of the polis and call into question the work that makes man's social and political life possible, hence the feeling of melancholic haphazardness. Hannah Arendt's conception of the new men of the modern era, for whom it was important to mobilize the instincts and emotions of the masses for their own selfish purposes, aptly fits the behavior of Woodrow Wilson in the aftermath of the First World War, as well as Harry Truman's decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on the civilians of 2 Japanese cities. In both cases, we are confronted with an imagination that operated at the expense of common sense and rationality. We have dubbed our modern era as the Age of Discontentment, because it began with Cartesian and Hobbesian discontentment over the rationalist philosophy of Aristotle, and continued with a Hegelian-inspired discontentment with critical Kantian philosophy. This means that, in the light of Kant's proposed 100,000-year journey for the species of man, we might be witnessing a period of regression rather than progression. We ought to recall that, for the Freud that wrote the interpretation of dreams, psychic regression occurred in the dream context, when the energy of a part of the brain was used to create the images of the dream, rather than for the purposes of external sensory or motor activity. We might, that is, in a dream, believe that we are swimming, but that is a mistaken belief, because no external sensory or motor activity is occurring. Similarly, in a dream, when we believe we are seeing a figure approaching in a blue shirt, this is not a genuine case of seeing, but rather the work of the imagination. We firmly believe we are seeing in the dream context, yet it is nevertheless true that what we are seeing, or think we are doing, is not real. It is nevertheless significant in that what is happening may well be related to the wish-fulfillment structure of the dream, a structure regulated by the pleasure-pain principle and the energy regulation principle, governing the wish to continue sleeping. On this view, because in the dream scenario, the faculty of sensibility does not involve the cognitive process of synthesizing representations for the purposes of understanding or knowing the truth, it is the sensible power of the imagination that is at work using the medium of images. Insofar as the identity of the discipline of psychology was concerned, one of the central moments of the 19th century came in 1870, when a group of prominent scientific psychologists coined a definition of psychology that, in fact, redefined the direction that the subject would take in the future, a direction that appeared to focus on the term psyche, sush, and construe this term very differently from earlier more philosophical characteristics, such as those we find in both Aristotle and Kant. The first wave of theorists were, in fact, structuralist psychologists who defined psychology as the science of consciousness, and who also attempted an empirical atomistic experimental approach to the role of sensations and feelings in our experience. William James opposed this approach and wrote a work entitled The Principles of Psychology, which was classified as a functionalist approach to the phenomena and conditions of mental life. He did not, however, conceive of principles philosophically, or in the way that Freud would have, but he did define mental life in practical rather than theoretical terms. The pursuance of future ends and the choice of means for their attainment are thus the mark and criterion of mentality in a phenomenon. Principles of Psychology, Volume 1, page 8. Furthermore, we see in this definition of mentality a clear distinction between the Socratic/ancient Greek ideas of the good in itself and the good in its consequences, And we should also recall that, in this connection, important ideas like justice involved both of these goods. A phenomenon has its conditions, some of which may fall into the categories of material and efficient causation, especially when we are dealing with phenomena related to sensibility. When, on the other hand, we consider higher mental states and processes related to action and knowledge states and processes, formal and final causes in relation to the principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason, shift more into focus. James, however, was somewhat ambivalent in relation to these Aristotelian and Kantian principles, and preferred a more down-to-earth philosophy of pragmatism that eschewed all forms of theoretical rationalism. Aristotelian and Kantian conditions of phenomena involve both the above rationalist principles of Sush, which must be discussed in terms of a wider definition of life that includes both plant and animal forms. Such discussion must take into consideration both archaeological and teleological conditions. When these conditions relate to actualizing a self that is aiming at rationality via discourse, we need to embed such a discussion in a complex mental framework, which includes instincts and the faculty of sensibility in general. What is also needed is reference to the categories of understanding/judgment and the principles of reason. William James's pragmatic philosophy was a child of its time, focusing upon the notion of consciousness. It was, however, also heeding classical concerns relating to the importance of the will, and the Greek conceptions of arete and arche. James discusses Hume's interest in the role of habit, but, unlike Hume, views this practical phenomenon through the framework of consciousness. The contribution of mental life to the formation of habits, for James, requires the operation of the power of consciousness. The already formed habit probably only requires the presence of consciousness to, firstly, begin the action, and secondly, monitor what happens if something goes wrong, and thirdly, conclude the act at the end of the process when one is viewing the result. For Freud, the level of subconsciousness involved in the habitual action would partly correspond to his notion of the preconscious part of our minds, which is used non-observationally by the motor system to perform learned habitual actions in accordance with arete. Arete, in such contexts, where we are concerned with the construction and use of artifacts such as library chairs, is connected to techne that, in turn, uses that form of instrumental/causal reasoning which has been so important for civilization-building activities of all kinds. This kind of action does not fall into the category of actions whose telos is connected to dike, justice, where the issue for Sush is the outcome, ananke, of the battle of the giants, Eros and Thanatos, and possibly the ruin and destruction of the polis. We discussed the learning of skills and habitual performance in Volume 1 of The World Explored, The World Suffered, a philosophical history of psychology, cognition, emotion, consciousness, and action. Both sensory and motor ideas combine to form objects of the mind. A skill, for example, is represented by James in the brain as a sequence of muscular contractions of which there is a sensation for each contraction. These sensational impressions exist below the level of conscious ideation which otherwise is usually present at the beginning of the activity, e.g. seeing the piano, and at the end when one becomes aware of the completion of the activity, of playing the piano. According to James, it is a different matter when we are learning a skill where much work is then done at the conscious level of ideation. We test each sensation by consciously comparing, choosing, rejecting, etc. Even moving on to the next component in the sequence of the learning process is a conscious act. There is no thematic concept of consciousness in Hume, although he does speak of the importance of forming habits, which, on James's account, can only be achieved through the active conscious awareness of what is right and what is wrong. This allows James to use the concept of a will that can consciously envision the activity it is about to undertake before the fact. It is this consciousness of the whole activity that then subsequently, when the activity has begun, enables us to know exactly where we are in the chain of events constituting the activity. If, for example, I am interrupted in the act of saying something, I remember what I have said and what I am about to say in virtue of this initial conscious awareness of the whole. Pages 312 to 13. The divorce of psychology and philosophy occurred immediately prior to William James' work. In the lead-up to this series of events, Hegel's criticism of Kant's works was decisive, and used the authority of Berlin University to neutralize the critical philosophy that had previously been sponsored by the University of Königsberg. Kant had restored the hylomorphic ideas of matter and form that had previously been successful in the combating of the materialism and dualism of Aristotle's time. Hegel's dialectical-based phenomenology allowed these alternatives to re-emerge in the name of an idea of spirit that used dialectical reasoning in a context of exploration/discovery which, paradoxically, regarded the logical rational principles operating in contexts of explanation/justification as metaphysical, the dreams of spirit seers. It was Hegel's expressed intention to turn Kant's work upside down, and thereby undermine his centering of practical reason around the Greek ideas of sus, archi, arete, dike, episteme, phronesis, and eudaimonia. Greek practical reasoning had, during the Dark Ages, been marginalized by Christian criticism. Pelagus, for example, proposed the idea of a free will, which St. Augustine felt compelled to combat in the name of the Christian Church, and an idea of a God, who was the ultimate cause in a deterministic causal system. It was, however, Aquinas who felt the gravitas of Aristotelian argumentation, and allowed scholars to once again entertain the possibility of hylomorphic accounts of sus. Aquinas also felt that Pelagus was a threat, and in his reinterpretation of Aristotle's work marginalized the importance of both Aristotle's metaphysics, that all men desire to know, and Aristotle's ethics, that all human activities, including the arts and the sciences, aim at the good. Man, for both Augustine and Aquinas, was a flawed being, because of his problematic relation to both God and the Word of God, the biblical form of logos, which meant something different to the ancient Greeks. Just as sensibility does not judge in relation to the truth, so it does not judge in relation to the good. Instinctive desires are either satisfied or not. If the more primitive desires are requited, a state of homeostasis is established in the organism's body. If not, the organism finds itself in a state of disequilibrium, and might even die if the deficiency is serious. There is, in this situation, an intricate relation between the energy regulation principle and the pleasure-pain principle, but instincts are blind insofar as the understanding of the good is concerned. This is not to deny that at the level of sensibility and instinct, there is a primitive kind of intelligence, insofar as meeting the needs of survival are concerned. The medium that this intelligence operates in, however, is the medium of feeling and images, and involves the faculty of the imagination more than the faculty of the understanding. Aristotle investigated the life instinct, eros, in a categorical framework, at least as complicated as that of Freud's, and without thematizing the concept of consciousness. Knowing, for Aristotle, could be applied over a whole range of phenomena stretching from the bare awareness involved in the activity of seeing to the knowing involved in logical reasoning in a complex argument such as, "All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal." The above form of reasoning presupposes a faculty of understanding operating categorically at a conceptual level, as well as the principles of reasoning, non-contradiction, and sufficient reason. It is at this level that we are confronted with the epistemological problems of truth and knowledge, and the ethical problem of the good in both theoretical and practical contexts. Form and matter play decisive roles in such an argument. Conceptual forms differ from sensible forms in the way in which the higher mental processes related to the faculty of the understanding differs from the lower-level operation of the imagination. The unconscious, Freud claims, does not operate in accordance with the principle of non-contradiction, which, in the domain of the practical, involves the operation of the will in the decision to do X or not do X, where X is an action. Negation, in the arena of action insofar as it is at the level of consciousness, must involve conceptualization, at least insofar as the rational animal capable of discourse is concerned, and this involves a level of organization of representations that is above and beyond the scope of the faculty of sensibility in general, and the imagination in particular. According to Kant, the manifold of representations are synthesized under a concept belonging to a system of categories, which, in turn, imply the operation of the principles of non-contradiction and sufficient reason. Language is used conceptually, with understanding, when it is used to name a manifold of representations, or alternatively, to predicate something of a named manifold. Language can also be used to signify an emotional state, as is the case when someone shouts out the name of a long-absent friend encountered at an airport, or alternatively, where one fearfully shouts at a bear to get away. In these latter cases, sensibility is expressing itself through, or via, the medium of language, which can also be used to express thoughts given the propensity of language to picture a state of affairs in its absence. According to Julian Jaynes, however, language probably began as some kind of warning cry, before the establishment of civilizations, whilst man lived in a state of nature. With the advent of naming objects, the faculties of understanding and reason began to form, and with the advent of naming people and remembering them in their absence, perhaps after their death, memory became an important mental function, and an important complement to the language functions that signify or symbolize what ought to be the case in the future. This complex of mental operations then constituted a teleological orientation, which in turn forms the basis for the creation and implementation of laws for a possible polis. Language functions, then, stretch from the simple primitive expressions of the sensible faculty to the sublime logic of the ethical syllogism that illuminates the essence of that cultural act of promising, e.g., promises ought to be kept. Jack promised Jill he would pay the money back he is borrowing. Therefore Jack ought to pay the money back to Jill. This is the Kantian region of logos, which far surpasses the naming function of language. In the above syllogism, something declarative is being said about promising in general, and an individual promise in particular. What we also see in the above form of reasoning is a complicated use of both the imperative and declarative voices of language. The major premise, promises ought to be kept, has the force of a principle, archi, and both the Kantian faculties of understanding and reason are involved in the formation of the principle and its subsequent application. The voices of language referred to are obviously related to thought, as conceived from an ancient Greek point of view, Socrates. Thinking is talking to oneself. For Freud, the voices of melancholy and aggression connect to his triangle of desire, which has its roots deep in the faculty of sensibility. Now, whilst it is undoubtedly the case that the expressions of emotion and instinct have no categorical intent, it is also true that such expressions serve important individual and social purposes. Let it not be forgotten that in his work Civilization and its Discontents, Freud pictured the fate lying in wait for our societies, in terms of the battle between Eros and Thanatos, the creative and destructive instincts and their vicissitudes. Kant's critical philosophy may well have approved of this kind of proclamation, given his view of man's 100,000-year view of the journey toward a kingdom of ends. This journey, he argued, was made more complex by the fact that man is in need of a master, but because of his self-love, he rejects the authority of all who seek to be his master. These aspects of Kant's theory explain his judgment relating to the melancholic haphazardness of social and political life. Freud's explanation of melancholy and aggression is, in terms of his triangle of desire, in which the demands motivated by man's self-love or narcissism are often refused and result in a wounded ego, which, in turn, gives rise to melancholic or aggressive responses. This 100,000-year journey toward a better life is also overshadowed by the words of the ancient Greek oracle. Everything created by man is destined for ruin and destruction. Science, for Freud, who was living in the era of positivism and its obsession with the experimental method, which rejected what it took to be the dogmatic attitude of philosophy, was analyzed as a deflection from the telos of life. Freud's position was a marked contrast to the position of those scientific psychologists intent upon blazing a trail for psychology in the name of the experimental method based on observation and the manipulation and measurement of variables. The context for this kind of scientific activity was obviously a context of exploration/discovery, and the voice of such scientific inquiry was the interrogative voice. Freud's psychology is founded upon what he called his mythology of the instincts and their vicissitudes. This, in the modern hylomorphic terms proposed by PMS Hacker, Human Nature, the categorical framework, is an account of human powers, capacities, and their vicissitudes. The power of language is, of course, a power Freud appreciated and used in accordance with the principles of practical, arete, and productive science, techne. In doing so, he made use of the declarative voice/power of language when he explained and justified the need for his cathartic treatment. When, that is, he transformed the emotions and passions of sensibility into the understanding associated with concepts and principles. He did not initiate grammatical investigations, but he was certainly using language for teleological purposes. In some circumstances we can imagine the analysand confessing a secret anxiously, or wishing manically for something impossible, and the language involved in such circumstances would be rooted in the faculty of sensibility, aided and abetted by the power of an imagination, unfettered by the demands of what Freud called the reality principle. The relationship between the analyst and the analysand has a transactional aspect, and this might suggest that a language game for two persons is being played, a language game whose purpose is to set the slave in this relationship free by maneuvering the subject into understanding the truth about themselves, using the reality principle. Freud, in his reflections, refocuses the light of psychology in relation to the problems of life, Sush, in a unique fashion, which acknowledges the relation of life to death in general, but in particular to life as a game that must be lost. Adrian Stokes, Collected Papers, Tamworth, UK, Carcanet Press, 1973. Life, if it is a game, is certainly a very serious game that is only sometimes taken seriously. It has the most serious of outcomes, which defines its essence, namely death, the non-existence of life. It is also, however, the essence of life to strive, or will its future continuous existence. Some Greek oracle, sometime, may well have said or thought, all life forms, in spite of Eros, will come to an end and degenerate into an inorganic form of existence. Freud's psychology captured the above spirit adequately, only toward the end of his writings, when he turned more specifically to the Greeks for the inspiration to deal with his most difficult cases. It was also this later elaboration upon his earlier positions that enabled him to reflect upon and analyze the behavior of groups and societies. This, of course, resulted in the depressing worldview that we encounter in Civilization and its Discontents. Wittgenstein's concession to Kantian and Freudian melancholy manifested itself in his view of the decline of Western civilization, which he pointed to in several cultural remarks, e.g., he thought he could hear the sound of engines in early 20th century classical music. So, Kant, Freud, and Wittgenstein all shared a pessimistic worldview grounded in a philosophical psychology that transcended the scientific psychology of their times. Freud, conscious of the colonizing attempt of positivistic science, and its contempt for all forms of knowledge not arrived at by an observationally based scientific inductive method, referred to his mythology of the instincts in reaction to this state of affairs. We tend to forget the ethical implications of Freud's theories because we choose to ignore the historical facts of the time, namely that mentally ill patients were on the whole treated immorally and incarcerated in institutions which had no idea of how to treat them. Freud's moral treatment respected the human dignity of his patients and provided them with a free diagnostic environment and a hope for a better future. Aristotle, Kant, Freud, and Wittgenstein can, then, lay claim to being philosophers of life, and it can moreover be argued that insofar as practical reason is concerned, all of these thinkers are rationalists, who also embrace empiricism in their descriptions of the sensible powers of the human form of life. Insofar as sensation or feeling is the subject of the practical aesthetic judgment, we can compare the empiricist account relating to the judgment of taste in relation to wine discussed by Hume, with the aesthetic judgment of the beautiful and sublime discussed by Kant. For Kant, Hume's account of taste is not an account of the reflective form of judgment, which involves the faculty or power of the understanding, but is rather a more primitive form of judgment that relies solely upon the naming function of language and its relation to the faculty of sensibility. In relation to this form of judgment, we can turn to the principles regulating the sensible faculty that we find in Merleau-Ponty's work, The Phenomenology of Perception. In this work, Merleau-Ponty refers to the laws of association that unite the words for sensations with the named sensations. One who, upon detecting a taste of iron in the wine, will associate this with the word iron. Now, whilst this may be an adequate account for the empiricist, it is not so for Merleau-Ponty, who claims that we have a lived relation to sensation, which in its turn suggests that the relation of the sensation to the judgment, "there is a taste of iron in the wine," is not merely causal in the Humean sense. Rather, there is, in these circumstances, some form of lived identity between the non-reflective judgment of taste and the sensation. This discussion bears to some extent upon the discussion of sexual sensations in the phenomenology of perception. For Freud, sexual sensations are an important part of the experiences of life and the individual's personality. On Freud's account, the bodily sources of these sensations are important material and efficient causes of the sexual experience, and this is also partly confirmed by Merleau-Ponty, who sees that sexuality is an important expression of the life of the phenomenological subject. The later Freudian account of sexuality points out that the sexual relation to another person can be purely instinctual, but it can also be overlaid by vicissitudes of those instincts that are related to what we call love, an important task for the ego. Merleau-Ponty, in the spirit of phenomenology, replaces the scientific notion of cause with that of meaning or operative reason. Such meanings are manifested in the syntheses of perceptions, which Merleau-Ponty is careful to distinguish from the syntheses involved in judgments, acts, or predications. I cannot put perception into the same category as the syntheses represented by judgments, acts, or predications. Merleau-Ponty, M. Translated Smith C. London, Routledge, p.11. Merleau-Ponty claims in the above work that the perception of a black pen must be separated from the work involved in a perceptual judgment. This pen is black, and this may, to some extent, be the case in the sense that Kant, for example, drew a sharp distinction between the activity of thinking something, e.g. either pen or black, and the more complex activity of thinking something about something, e.g. this pen is black. This latter complex judgment is a truth-making or veritative synthesis, which includes the simpler syntheses of those representations constituting pen or black. In these latter simple syntheses, the realm of thinking something, names rigidly designate what they are names of, and this is indicated by the phrase, this pen. Such concepts, which are rigid designators of particulars, however, have a different logical structure to those that are occupying the role of predicating something of something. These latter concepts are intending to designate the many, and to that extent may be regarded as more abstract, but this may not be a useful way of making the distinction between these types of concepts. Many things in the world are black, but only one thing is designated by the rigid designation of this pen. Psychologically speaking, there can also be this sensation of the blackness of this pen, and both the sensation and the blackness form what Merleau-Ponty called a lived unity of the perceptual activity of a lived body, which is the home of many different kinds of meanings. This recalls Freud's remarks that the human body is a naturally occurring experiment, operating in a field of natural causes. Merleau-Ponty, however, is inclined to reject the term cause on the grounds of its modern scientific definition, and this ignores the Aristotelian claim that there are 4 different kinds of causes, atia, or forms of explanation. Modern scientific concepts of causation often restrict themselves to material and efficient causation, embraced by Hume as paradigms, and tend to question whether, in some cases, final causes can, in any sense, exist. The validity of formal causes as explanations is also typically questioned on the grounds of appealing to categories or principles that might not always be accepted. For Merleau-Ponty, there is a fundamental difference between what can be lived through and what can be thought. For Kant, on the other hand, the truth-making synthesis that constitutes the judgment, this pen is black, is necessarily related to the categories of the understanding and the principles of reasoning, non-contradiction, sufficient reason, which are called into question by both Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology generally. Operative reason, or operative intentionality, are the syntheses that constitute what the phenomenologists refer to as the anti-predicative world, a world formed by a non-thinking kind of consciousness that does not operate in accordance with the laws of association, but rather relates intentionally to reality via the medium of meaning. There is no space in this kind of account for a mechanism of association in relation to the elements of stimulus and response, favored by behaviorist explanations of experience. Embracing a science of behavior, in response to the inadequacies of a science of consciousness that focused upon sensations and feelings, brought with it new and different problems, related to all attempts at materialistic reductions of life to something observable. Freud avoided both of these sets of problems by defining consciousness as a vicissitude of instinct, and regarding consciousness as one power amongst others that all need to be integrated if adequate responses to the exigencies of the external world are to be possible.